Good morning to everyone here. It's nice to see the crowd here and a very broad cross-section of this university present. Welcome. This is the first live presidential panel on policy and politics that we've had for 3 years or so. And it's such a pleasure to see you all in person and to be part of this event. I call it P4 because I can never remember all those 4 words of presidential panel on policy and politics. So P4 was started right after the 2016 election because there was a lot of consternation in this university about what just happened. So we felt it was important for this very much head down university without many undergraduates to keep us on our toes, to ask the question of, don't we need to do more with our university community in terms of being more aligned with what's going on out there in the real world? And of course, we have a law school, which tends to keep me aligned, and a social work school, which tends to do the same thing. But it's nice to do these things formally as a university, to be able to talk about what's important. So that's how this P4 program came to be. And of course, it was to talk about higher ed issues. It was to talk about policy and finance from a federal level. And of course, it was to talk about politics, which is of course the topic today on the heels of our most recent election. So today we have 2 very notable luminaries in the world of commentators. Can I use that word? Luminary?
He's the luminary, yeah.
We could get you crowns, luminaries, to have them
Luminaries.
here. And I suspect they do not need an introduction, but I shall do so anyhow. We have Mara Liasson and Jonah Goldberg, who's here on our stage. Jonah, I've gotten to know by the internet and reading what he's written. And I guess I don't frequent your website enough, but now I will. For conservative insight and keen wit, and you may also know that he has he's editor of the Dispatch, for those of you who read that. We also have a veteran NPR reporter, Mara Liasson, and I certainly was well acquainted with Mara because if there's one thing I enjoy a lot, it's the NPR program. So they are both here with us today. As I was preparing for this, I was surprised to hear, happily surprised in a certain respect, that you don't just take one side of the road or the other. You're on Fox News, you're on NPR, you've got a lot of variety. And I think that's really an important message, at least for us at this university, to understand that it's a complex world. There's not right and wrong. So, excuse me for a minute. Papers stick together. There they go. So All Things Considered has been on for a long time. I think I remember hearing that in the 70s and 80s. It's just been around forever, and it just always is insightful to me. So thank you for that program. So we're going to have a broad discussion here, and sort of the game plan is to have a conversation with the 2 of them initially for about 45 minutes, and then open up the mics for questions from the audience. And I guess we're getting an echo there. Yes. So that'll sort of be the plan. So maybe to start off things, first of all, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. So I looked it up this morning and the score was 218 to 211. Now, you all know I'm a surgeon. I can tell you, I never looked that up in my career before. I would have never been that close to an election. And yet here I am looking it up. And so we've got this special vote that's not quite done, but it looks like the majority is pretty certain, doesn't it?
Yeah.
In the House. And so I guess maybe my first question to the 2 of you is, what happened? One, what's your perspective on this, and what does it mean for us in this world?
You want to go first?
Well, we're trying to figure that out. I mean, look, covering politics is an exercise in humility. every day we get to learn that something we thought was true was wrong. And that's what happened this time. I think there are a lot of things you can point to. I have never seen a herd mentality lock in sooner or more extremely than this time, even though the polls were not wrong. If you put aside the partisan polls, the polls were not wrong, but we journalists did a bad job educating people what the margin of error meant, and pundits completely ignored what the margin of error meant. And everyone, Democrats and Republicans, thought there would be a big wave. There were some, iconoclastic voices who are now being, vindicated. But what happened was, I guess the simplest way to say it is that we were being very left brain. We were saying, oh, look, inflation, top concern. That must mean they'll vote against the incumbent party, because that's what we've seen in the past. Historical rules only work till they stop working. And the other thing I know is that it's hard to make predictions, especially about the future. So all of the things we thought we knew, we applied to this year, and we were wrong. And just as an example of what happened, if you took the exit polls without knowing who won, just the exit polls, and you looked at them, and then you were asked, well, from these exit polls, not pre-polls, who won this election? The exit polls showed people thought Republicans were better on the economy, Republicans were better on immigration, inflation, crime, immigration. Biden was very unpopular, and Democrats still won. People who thought all those things still went into the booth and voted for Democrats. Why? I think that they decided, this is kind of to quote George W. Bush, who sat in his clear plastic poncho when he was listening to Donald Trump's inaugural address and said that was some weird, expletive deleted. This was what the voters decided, that they didn't want any more weird, expletive deleted. And even though, yes, abortion waxed and waned, and for a while it was a big concern and then it wasn't, but abortion meant something other than just abortion. It went into this soup with election denialism, January 6th, abortion, all of the crazy things that Republican candidates were saying, and voters just voted against crazy. I mean, that's the simplest. We don't know yet. We have a lot more research to do, but that's the simplest take.
I think that's largely. I largely agree with that. I think I entirely agree with it. I just put it slightly differently. Is that I think Republicans did have. Let's put it this way: the red wave happened. The problem was there was a counter wave going the other way. Florida was just this amazing thing, right? Lee Zeldin in New York, who I'm not particularly fond of, but he came shockingly close to winning the governorship. Andrew Cuomo won his election, I think, in 2018 by 20-something points, and Lee Zeldin almost, had it within like 3 or 4 points. And he had coattails, and so there were a bunch of seats in Long Island and elsewhere that flipped Republican. On the generic ballot, lots of people voted Republican. There was more shifts towards Republican. In some ways, the way to think about it is that Nate Cohn made this point for the New York Times. Anywhere where voters thought that the election denier crowd could actually have actual impact on the law, right, or on the way elections are done, they got punished. Anywhere where they thought that the anti-abortion candidates could actually have their way, they got punished. And so those two things, election denying and the abortion stuff, added into that correlates heavily with Trump endorsement and crazy, right? That was just a drag on the ticket. They've now figured it out that a Trump endorsement cost you about 5 points. That was the penalty for it. But anywhere where those two issues really weren't at play, so like New York State's not going to become a pro-life state, right? No one was really afraid of that. And no one really was afraid that the election denying stuff would take hold there. And so Republicans had a good night. Anywhere in the country where that counter wave wasn't active, Republicans had their sort of good night. It just wasn't enough. Because normally, I wasn't predicting a massive red wave. My position was, I thought it was going to be close to the historic norm. basically since the Civil War, there had been only 3 midterms in a first term of a presidency where the party in power didn't lose seats. And since I think 82, it was the average is like 26 seats or something like that. So I thought it's going to be somewhere in that range, 22 to 26 seats or something like that. And if you didn't have the turnout effect of those other factors, I think that's what would have happened. And so the net result of this is that it was a great night for what we in the sort of let's just call it Trump skeptical conservative community call it. It was a great night for Republican normies. Mike DeWine won by like 28 points. DeSantis won by like 20 points, and I know DeSantis is a little more on the controversial side. Chris Sununu won by like 20 something points. Meanwhile, they overperformed all the nutters who went down in flames because they were election deniers. And so for someone like me who has stayed out of the pro-Trump stuff for 7 years and paid quite a price for it, this was a great election for me because everyone who I thought was ruining the Republican Party took it on the chin. For the most part, you know, Kerry Lake's loss was good. All the election deniers conceded defeat, which was great for the country.
Except for Mark Fincham, but he probably will.
Yeah. But that actually makes the election deniers look worse, right? If you have one holdout sort of saying, oh no, but really like, you know, the Chinese and the Venezuelans stole the election for everybody. And I'm the only one brave enough to point it out, right? And so in a certain sense, I kind of feel like nature is healing.
The American voter was more sensible, nuanced, and more of a complex thinker than we gave him or her credit for. And that was really heartening. Yeah, I mean, that was just extraordinary. The other thing that we're in the job of hot takes and explaining things right away. It's going to take a long time to figure out what happened. Just like after 2016, we didn't realize how many white non-college voters Trump actually brought out. This election was not that nationalized. We think of it
very regional.
Look at Michigan had a blue wave. New York State had a red wave, and Florida had a red tsunami. Right. But the thing about New York
and Guam, you can't leave out Guam.
Can't leave out Guam. The thing about New York that's so interesting. Okay, was it overreaching by the New York legislature to draw that blue partisan gerrymander, or was it the fact that state Supreme Courts in blue states don't like partisan gerrymanders, where in red states they let them go? Was it also a factor that the New York Post talked about crime 24 hours a day? Didn't really affect Pennsylvania, you know, but it did affect New York. So it's really complicated. And like I said, we should all be really humble about our hot takes here.
But it's reassuring for me to hear from you the opinion that there actually was wisdom. The voters, right? Which gives me hope, because that's what I think I've been searching for. Where's the hope, the future of our country?
The hope is us. There's not going to be anybody coming like Deus Ex Machina to save us. Yeah, and so far, okay, so this was a good day for American voters.
I think that's right.
And big turnout, that's another thing. Big turnout election. I think about 2018 size, maybe a tiny bit less, which is good, because that was historic. So people are participating more.
So who were the voters that turned out? I know there were a lot of, there's a lot of data yet to be learned, but what are the different groups that came out that are different from the past?
Sure. So like one place where Mara and I kind of disagree. I have never been all that upset about low voter turnout. Low voter turnout is also a sign that people don't think politics matters that much. And the fact that we had massive turnout in these last few elections I don't think that's highly correlated with the health of our democracy, because people feel like, oh my gosh, if I don't vote, democracy's over and all that kind of stuff. I mean, I'm glad that they turned out to vote that way, but it'd be better that they didn't feel like it was this existential need to vote. So I've never thought that voting was this in and of itself as wonderful as a lot of the.
In a sign of a healthy democracy.
Not necessarily a sign.
Yeah, you're just saying we don't need that. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but in terms of like, so this is an interesting point about one of the reasons why we all got it wrong is that And Mara's absolutely, I think Mara's absolutely right. Polling actually, if you take out the partisan polls, the Republican sponsored polls that threw off all the averages, like the New York Times and Siena and all those kinds of, they got the race basically right.
In the margin of error, yeah.
That said, the days of polling are probably numbered. It is very, very hard to poll.
Yes, nobody wants to talk to pollsters.
Yeah, no one likes to talk to pollsters. Republicans really don't like to talk to pollsters, and young people just they don't even know what a landline is, right? And that's what polling was based on for all our lives. And so one of the arguments that you'll hear is that places like Michigan, where abortion really seems to have been a driver, the polls missed a lot of young people who were very motivated, particularly in college towns, who were essentially bussed in. I'm nothing wrong with that. I'm not, criticizing it, but they're buzzing in large numbers, and they were somewhat invisible to the polling. And so you saw up until the exit polls, abortion was pretty low ranked in terms of priority, and then you see the exit polls, and it turns out all of these people were essentially invisible to pollsters because they were young people who don't respond to pollsters. Turns out it was their number one issue, and that's another cause for humility. But like if part of my argument about why politics is so messed up is that it's not that partisanship is very strong, but the parties are very, very weak, and weak parties create strong partisanship.
Yep.
And if you actually had well-run parties that took care to protect their brand and their long-term institutional interests, you would see a total cleaning house of the whack jobs after this election. And it would be, let's put up the normal, boring Republicans because they did really, really well. Voters moved towards normal, boring Republicans in large numbers. Given that, what was it, 2 nights ago, we had the Mar-a-Lago announcement, it's not necessarily obvious that we're going to go that way. But this does give the forces of boring normalcy in the Republican Party a lot of ammo.
So there's hope for me.
Keep hope alive.
The boring party, right?
Yeah, well, I don't get called by pollsters often, and of course with cell phones, you don't answer them, but I would never tell a pollster what I was really thinking. That's,
See, there you go.
my business.
I think the New York Times said something, they went into the field and they got 0.4% response of people who were willing to answer the whole survey.
Right.
That means polling, as Jonah said, polling is on the way out.
There's this great sort of era of experimentation we're about to enter, where people are trying to do different ways of asking people things, right? Through internet surveys and all that. The problem is like it used to be with 98% of Americans having a landline.
Yeah.
You knew that statistically the sample was going to be fairly representative if you had a big enough, solid enough effort. With these different techniques, you just don't know if there's a massive selection bias somewhere built into it. And so we're not there yet, but like polling is got real problems.
Well, they get me on the social media too, If they polled through the social media, they would miss a lot of my generation.
Sure.
So maybe the takeaway I'm hearing is that there was a victory for democracy over the past election, that in fact voters did vote for what they thought was important for America as opposed to just what the party was. Did I hear that?
Yeah, I mean, it's still true that 90% of Americans are locked into one party or the other, and the number of swing voters is very small. But there is no doubt that there were a lot of voters who voted, Republican for governor, for a normal governor. I mean, Kemp was kind of a normie, right? DeWine, but then voted Democrat down ballot. And the interesting or didn't vote or left that line blank. That's another really important thing. I bet there are a lot of Georgia ballots that had the Senate line blank.
That's right.
Who voted for Brian Kemp on top. But to me, the victory for democracy is the defeat of the election deniers, not across the board, because the majority of the House Republicans were election deniers before Election Day, and now there are even more of them. That's not the issue. The issue is Secretary of State races, governors, attorney generals, people who have the positions that have control over how votes are cast and counted and certified. Those guys lost. Yeah. and especially in battleground states. So that's the definition of good for democracy to me.
Yeah, it's also, it's at the margins, right? I mean, because there were still lots of people who voted for a lot of election deniers and all that, but yeah, at the margins, the corrections were against the kind of crazy stuff. And I do think, I'm curious what Mara thinks about this, but like, I think the election deniers are wrong. What they were doing was incredibly cynical and dangerous. I certainly think that no place being secretaries of state and all that kind of stuff. But it's become a kind of shorthand in journalism and punditry world to say that if you denied the 2020 election, which I did not do, at all, but if you denied the 2020 election, ipso facto, that means you would cheat given the opportunity in any election going forward. And I don't think it actually always plays out that way. Some of that was really just a show of fealty and loyalty.
It's like a troubled performative thing.
To Trump's BS, right? And the fact that all these deniers actually conceded, or most of these deniers conceded, the fact that you actually have these stories. I've heard a couple on NPR of people who actually signed up to be poll workers because they thought the elections were rigged, and then when they got in the door and they actually saw how it worked, they changed their minds. And I think there's if you actually look at the polling of people who think that prior to the election, of people who think that that democracy is in peril, that was a very bipartisan thing. And Republicans think Democrats could, and that's the problem, is that both parties are obsessed with somewhere between outright lies and wild exaggerations. There is not a huge voter suppression problem in this country, nor is there a huge election fraud problem in this country. And you can point to things at the margins, you can point to certain anecdotes, but for the most part, we have very clean, very competent elections in this country. And Democrats have used the voter suppression thing as a messaging thing to turn out their base for a long time. And now Republicans are using the fraud thing to turn out their people for a long time.
It backfires. In other words, voter suppression is a motivator, especially for the African-American community, because voter suppression has been very real in American history. Historically,
yeah.
But election denial sends the message, hey, if it's rigged, why go vote?
Right.
But the thing about, I'm not as sanguine as Jonah, because we've never seen this before. It certainly looked like we were going to have one party that refused to accept the legitimacy of any election they didn't win. I mean, as long as the leader was Donald Trump, it certainly looked like that. Now we're in a whole new world. I'm sure you're going to segue to that at some point, but because we don't know exactly where the Trump thing is going. But yeah, so I was certainly a little more worried.
Mm-hmm. No, I'm not saying the worry is unreasonable. I just think there's more green shoots out there.
Yes,
than people
yes, thank goodness. Right.
Green shoots, I like that. So maybe a question to segue, as you suggest, is in terms of the Democratic Party, where are they going? What do they need to do to be responsive to this country? Where do you see that happening?
So I think the great news out of the midterms is that Republicans are going to learn a lot of lessons that they need to learn. The bad news out of this election is the Democrats aren't going to learn a lot of lessons that they need to learn. And this has been a problem for the last 20 years, is that every party, whenever they win, they wildly overinterpret the mandate that they have. Biden had a mandate to do two things when he was elected: not be Donald Trump and return things to normalcy. He accomplished the first one really quickly. But the return to normalcy stuff, I don't think he quite delivered on. Some of it's not his fault, I mean, we can argue about inflation and, COVID and supply chains and all that kind of stuff. But I personally think that Joe Biden would be a disastrous, or at least extremely risky candidate in 2024. If you look at the exit polls, vast majorities of his own voters, of the Democratic voters, do not want him to run again. He is not popular. The idea that the Democratic Party would interpret this midterm when their own voters, particularly voters under 30, say they don't want him to run again, or simply do not approve of the job he is doing, as a huge referendum, positive referendum on Joe Biden, I think is kind of nuts. I also just think, given his age, and this is not purely an ageist thing, it's just, I think people recognize when loved one, we have these experiences in our own lives, and They can spin it any way they like, but he's having trouble. And waiting until he's 82, which is what he would be to run again, is just hugely risky. I mean, it's hugely risky just because he could fall.
Yeah.
You know, campaigning is really hard on young men. And but now it's going to be very difficult to replace Biden. You already had, you know, like Swallows returning to Capistrano, Elizabeth Warren returning to the pages of the New York Times saying this election proves that we need to spend even more money on everything that we want to spend money on because we didn't pay a price for the earlier spending. I think that the Democratic Party has not come to grips with the fact that there's a difference between the electoral base and the activist base. And the electoral base of the Democratic Party, which is very heavily African-American women, they're to the right ideologically. They're still liberal, but they're well to the right of the hardcore, very online, typically white, younger activist types who dominate and define the party's image from the White House to Twitter to cable news. And Biden misinterpreted, I think, the people who got him elected. It was middle-aged Black women in South Carolina who won him the primary. And the messaging from the White House has not reflected on that. And so I think they're setting themselves up some real problems in 2024, particularly if Donald Trump doesn't run.
I think that the reason that the election results were so confusing, it's going to be hard for both parties to figure out what lessons they're supposed to learn. It's easier right now for Republicans. Let's just go with the normies, right? That's very simple. For Democrats, it's a little harder. They dodged a bullet. They did not win.
Right.
See, this is what's so confusing. Same thing happened in 2020. Joe Biden won decisively at the top of the ticket, but Democrats lost seats in Congress. That was pretty confusing.
Right.
They both lost and won, and they totally misinterpreted their mandate. But I am not hearing, with the exception of a stray editorial from Elizabeth Warren, some kind of a result that, whoa, this shows that we should be more progressive and move to the left. As a matter of fact, the only progressive House candidate that defeated a moderate Democrat in the primary in Oregon lost to a Republican in a Biden +9 district. In other words, the message is that the Democratic electorate, just like in the primaries in 2020, did not go for Bernie Sanders. They went for old, sleepy, at that time, centrist Joe Biden. And I think that's still true. So the question is, they have an opportunity. They were not wiped out. That means they get some breathing room to fix their problems on immigration, crime, and all sorts of kind of left-wing cultural, excesses. Every time they say the word Latinx, they lose 100 Latino voters. They're not losing Latinx voters, they're losing Latino voters. So this is an opportunity for them. There are plenty of voices inside the Republican Party, inside the Democratic Party. Sometimes they call this popularism. Let's just go with things that are popular, not things that are popular with our fringe. Right. The problem also, Jonah mentioned a whole bunch of things, activists inside the donor class of the Democratic Party is super left. So that's, they have in other words, they have an opportunity. Mm-hmm. And let's see if they take it. We're not sure if you seem very confident the Republicans will learn their lesson. We don't know that.
No, I said that. I apologize. Yeah. It's sort of like my position on whether Donald Trump, the Republican Party, can cut Trump loose. I don't know if it's more likely. Yeah. It's more possible.
Yeah, and it certainly is clearer and simpler. Yeah. And clearer and simpler.
There's no serious lesson for the whack jobs to take away from this.
Other than you were
the
dog food, right. Yeah, we totally agree.
You haven't mentioned the Hispanic vote, particularly in Florida. So how do you see that, the two of you?
Hispanic vote is not monolithic, and the Hispanic vote in Florida is different. There is no doubt that Democrats have a problem with Hispanics. The Hispanic vote has not moved en masse to Republicans. It's very unclear what's happening, but along with all of the things I just mentioned that Democrats have to work on, Hispanics are certainly one of the biggest. They should not be doing as badly as they are along the border in Texas, But, you know, Venezuelans and Cubans in Florida are different. But the fact that Ron DeSantis won Miami-Dade, I mean, that's a huge problem. But it's not just a Hispanic problem. It's that the Democratic Party in Florida has collapsed. And if you were a smart, savvy billionaire, you would, like the Koch brothers did with the Libra project and all the things that you would say, I'm going to devote the next 10 years to rebuilding the Democratic Party infrastructure in Florida.
Yeah.
I mean, apparently I forget his name, but a Democratic billionaire did that in Colorado. That's why Colorado is blue now.
Yeah.
Blue now. It doesn't mean that money solves everything, but you start doing all the grassroots spade work you have to do. But yeah, Hispanics did not move to Republicans the way pundits told us they would.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. It's not just that the Democratic Party has crumbled in Florida, which it has. It's that the Republican Party is really, really competent in Florida.
Really,
I mean, and
the state party in the country.
Yeah, they're just solid, and also they have the best run elections in the country, and that's because of Jeb Bush, who's put these systems in place. But
yeah, all the votes. Did you notice that? Election night, we know who won. There's no day after day after day counting.
And then so when you have a really strong, competent party, a lot of local politicians just flip because that's where their bread is buttered, right? And so that has a galvanic effect of like drawing county, you know, the political infrastructure of the state towards one party.
It's the inverse of California.
That's right. And I was going to say a smart Republican billionaire should spend a lot of money trying to rescue the Republican Party of California, though that may be, you know, a lot, that may be like trying to revive the Shakers or something. The other thing about Mara's absolutely right. I have a long rant about Latinx. The progressive polling firms did this amazing work on this that was then picked up by Gallup and some other places. Mara's like literally right. Whenever you say Latinx, you turn away more Hispanics than you attract.
Yeah.
Because first of all, try degenderizing the Spanish language. Go have fun with that. But second of all,
which, believe it or not, is where Latinx comes. If someone's saying that, it's like, well, just write $10,000 check to Donald Trump instead of saying Latinx. It's the same thing.
It's very similar to how, like, there are some progressives who don't want to use the word mother anymore. And there's a birthing person, like said it a few times. And the thing is like, look, there's a well-established finding in the social science literature that says mothers are generally popular. And
yes, you have to do a lot of research to determine that.
There are a lot of voters who have one. And again, the impulse for this is like, I always try to explain this to a lot of my conservative friends. I have a lot of problems with political correctness or wokeness and all that kind of stuff. But a core part of it is just trying to have good manners.
Yeah.
It's trying to communicate to people on their own terms in ways that they don't find offensive. And good manners are supposed to be a conservative value. So I have no problem with that aspect of it. But it's actually a kind of bad manners to speak down to large populations and not use the words that they want to use to describe themselves. And Latino people, first of all, a lot of them don't want to call themselves Latino. They want to call themselves Mexican American or American or whatever, you know. And then there's this other problem, or this other aspect of it, is that Hispanic voters, generally speaking, become indistinguishable from the median voter as they move up the socioeconomic ladder.
Just as Italians and Irish and Greeks and everybody else became whiter and whiter and whiter as they moved up the
And so, like, the argument for why Hispanics so overwhelmingly voted Democratic has more to do with the fact that they were disproportionately low income, and low income people vote for the Democratic Party for all of the obvious historical and political reasons. But as they move up the socioeconomic ladder, they all become Republicans, but they just simply don't become obviously congenital Democrats the way a lot of people assume. And I think the Democratic Party bought into, about 20 years ago, this idea of
demography is destiny.
Democracy is destiny. You don't actually have to, you can just assume that people of color are going to vote for you. And that breeds a certain kind of condescension towards voters of color. And Republicans, it took them a long, long time, and they still screw it up all the time. So I'm not defending them, but like, it turns out that, like, it's really difficult to get people to vote for you if you don't ask them for their vote. And Republicans have kind of figured that out, at least particularly with the Hispanic community.
And just one thing that a sliver of hope that maybe Democrats are not as completely tone deaf and stupid and impervious to lessons as we think they are. They actually won some state legislative races. And that is something.
It's a big deal.
It's a big deal because they used to ignore them. For the past couple of cycles, they have tried and spent a lot of money and come up with nothing, but this time they succeeded. So it takes a long time and you have to stick with it. And one thing that Dobbs did, overturning Roe did, it reminded people, oh, lots of policies made on the state level. Gee, maybe we should pay attention to that instead of just focusing on Washington and the Supreme Court. But I'll tell you one other little thing, talk about, you know, all these atmospheric things that went into the soup that got us to the result of this election. Joking about Paul Pelosi was part of that.
So stupid.
But joking, being cruel and joking about Paul Pelosi was part of that.
Yeah, I agree. If you find yourself, I wrote about this afterwards, is like, just as a general rule, if your reaction or condemnation of an 82-year-old being hit in the head with a hammer requires finding out what their partisan ID is, you're doing life wrong. Right. I mean, like, it was just a horrible thing that happened. And the jokes made, you know, there's this standard line about a lot of this stuff where for the Trumpy part of the party, that the cruelty is the point. That hammered it home right before the election. It's incredibly stupid and just immoral. You know?
A deeply concerning event that was, and its aftermath is very concerning. You can see we're equal opportunity, by the way. I want to point out that to you, that both parties are getting criticized. So we're equal at this university. So extend your discussion a little bit to the Republican Party about the far right, about the Trumpism. Where do you see all of that going?
Well, look, we're in a really interesting moment in our, you know, in the era of Trump. First of all, I would say Trump went into this cycle as an 800-pound gorilla and he came out of the cycle as a 700-pound gorilla. I think he's still a pretty big gorilla, but he definitely, I mean, we're seeing something extraordinary. You know, we're seeing the donor class, the Murdoch, you know, empire, whatever, the conservative media, for the most part, turn against him. And that's an extraordinary thing. I mean, for the New York Post to cover his announcement with a little teeny headline, Florida man announces, and it's on page 26 or something, that's really something. And to totally throw their weight onto DeSantis, who is the future, according to the New York Post. Now that, I don't know about DeSantis. You know, that could also be one of those things that the Republican Party sees an easy answer to Donald Trump, and it might not be so easy. You know, Donald Trump gave the speech, criticized for being low energy, whatever. A lot of people thought this was a mistake. He should wait for the field to fill up, because the way Donald Trump can win the nomination in 2024 is the same way he won it the first time, against a crowded field. The Republican Party couldn't get its act together to coalesce around one non-Trump alternative. And he won with 30 to 40% of the vote. I can't remember exactly what. Weak party. I think back then there was a real failure of imagination among Republicans. They thought if they took 2 aspirin and lay down, when they got up, he'd be gone. He wasn't. And now, you know, really, will Mike Pompeo and Mike Pence and all those people step aside for Ron DeSantis? I don't know. We're going to find out. And we're also going to find out how firm Trump's grip is on the base of the Republican Party, and, you know, versus what we call vaguely and imprecisely the establishment.
No, I mean, like, so this is I should just use this on NPR a week ago, but the Republican Party in 2016 had what they call in game theory the belling the cat problem. It is in the interest of all the mice to put a bell on the cat. It is not in the interest in any individual mouse to be the one to put the bell on the cat. And in 2016, all the Republicans fought each other and left Trump alone, and all he needed was a sticky plurality, and he won it. That's still definitely open to him. I mean, we're now entering the really rank punditry phase of this conversation, but like, I am less confident that DeSantis becomes the nominee, in part because I've been through, and I was at National Review for 20 years. We would hear all the time, that Fred Thompson is the future and you just don't get it, right? And Scott Walker's got this locked up and all these kinds of things. And Rick Perry, right? Whoops. And you can go down a long list of these people who capture people's imagination very early in the process and then flame out. And part of the rap on DeSantis, and I've talked to a lot of people who spend a lot of time with him, is he's got incredibly low EQ. He cannot read a room. He cannot read faces. He's kind of on the spectrum. And I think in a primary that can play out. That doesn't bother me though, because if he wants to strap on the suicide vest and take out Trump, it's fine with me, right? But he is far more, I mean, like the way the media portrays him, and the media created DeSantis as much as anybody. The way they covered his handling of COVID, the way they turned him into a monster, that attracted Republicans' support. But I think that generally the populist boob bait guy, that's the fake DeSantis. The guy who got the bridge fixed in 3 days, that's the real DeSantis. He picks his culture war fights very cleverly and very deliberately, in part because he can't do it on the stump. He can't do it in person, so he figures out how to do it online, right? Anyway, I who knows? But I kind of think that he's the guy who takes out, he could end up being the guy who takes out Trump, but not actually the guy who gets the nomination. And that's, and I've been a DeSantis critic on all sorts of things, but I think people who say DeSantis is no different than Trump just do an incredible disservice. I think Trump is a unique threat to our institutions, uniquely narcissistic, sociopathic guy when it comes to norms and all the rest. DeSantis isn't that. You can think he's a bad Republican, you think he's a bad person, you can think he's too right-wing, all that kind of stuff. That's all fair game in a democracy, but he's a fairly conventional Republican politician compared to Donald Trump. And when you say he's no different than Trump, what you're really doing is saying that Trump is no different than a conventional Republican, which undermines the anti-Trump argument.
The other thing, just another point to make Jonah's point, the abortion bill in Florida is 15 weeks.
That's right.
It's not 6 weeks. It's not heartbeat. So you could say, oh, is he pro-choice?
Well, he made a very smart, it was a very smart move.
Yeah.
Point about how if you think abortion rights are threatened, you invite anti-Republican wave. He immediately, so did Glenn Youngkin, just said, here's our limit on abortion, and we're not going to talk about it anymore. You didn't talk about it. He doesn't say the pro. I'm sure he says he's pro-life. You have to say.
You know, most people are for Roe. Roe is the middle ground, and whether it's 24 or 15, we can argue about viability. But what he did in Florida was as much closer to Roe than what other Republican governors.
I think it's. I don't want to get in the weeds on a Roe fight, but like. I think it's closer to what people claim Roe is, right?
Yes.
That the Roe is the compromise position and kind of thing. But yeah, I think one of the things you're seeing on the right, which is going to play out in sort of fascinating ways, is the distinction between being adamantly pro-life and adamantly anti-Roe.
That's really different.
They're different things.
Anti-Roe, as in states decide.
States can do what they want.
It's legitimate. That's a very not a controversial thing.
Right. It's going to be. But because you have Republicans wanting a national federal ban or limit or whatever, and it'll be interesting to see who hides behind. I said, if this was a state's issue, I don't want to talk about.
Never mind.
Yeah, and then
Democrats would be smart. Here's another thing about whether Democrats will learn their lesson. If they would just codify Roe, they'd be fine. But they can't control themselves. The bills in the Senate, the reason it keeps failing is because it goes beyond Roe. If they just merely codified Roe, that's where 2/3 of Americans are.
Wow.
We could do this all day long.
Maybe switching to the Senate, we talked about the House. We need to talk about House leadership, and we need to talk about what happens in the Senate contingent upon how Georgia comes out. So take your pick, House or Senate.
I'll take House. You want Senate?
I'll say Senate.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I have to go back and find the clips, both audio and text, of me having my Schadenfreude-tastic dream of Kevin McCarthy getting the gavel and then losing it or not getting the gavel at all because of all the compromises he's made along the way. He he may end up being the Liz Truss of American politics. Like
Like the lettuce.
yeah, he could be
He could be the lettuce.
he could be a speaker for, weeks, if he gtes it at all. So the fascinating thing is, there are a lot of interesting things about this, but so there's a guy, Thomas Massey,
Yeah.
who's back guano crazy, right? He's the guy who sends out the Christmas card with his entire family armed to the teeth, like it's the zombie apocalypse. And he gave this great accurate quote to Politico a couple days after the election. He said, look, if you're looking for someone who's really upset about it being a slim Republican majority, you're gonna have to talk to somebody else, because the way it looks right now, the Massey caucus is going to have enormous power.
Yeah.
And he can be an enormous, like if you need 218 votes and you only have 217, his asks are going to be huge. The problem is all of them can play that game, right?
Taylor Green.
Yeah. And so it is going to be, we're not supposed to curse, this is a high-minded place. It's going to be a fecal festival of unprecedented proportions. And I think that as a conservative who's not necessarily all that into the Republicans, I would have rather that the Senate flip than the House, because Biden can still do all the judicial appointments. He can do a lot of things with control of the Senate that he couldn't do with control of the House. But there's an opportunity here. I was stunned. I just wrote about this, that the House Freedom Caucus's demands, most of them are actually pretty reasonable, and they would actually help reform the way the House runs, returning it to regular order. That said, there's an opportunity here for, I don't know if McCarthy's the right guy for it, for the Republicans to sort of marginalize the crazy caucus and actually work across the aisle with some Democrats on things that are popular. There's also an opportunity here for the crazy caucus to run the show. So I'm not like, all rainbows and unicorns here, but any of this kind of stuff. But the reality, the basic gist of it is that I don't think Kevin McCarthy is going to be up to this job, because I'm not sure anybody could be.
It's the smallest House majority since 1952 or 4. Kevin McCarthy has never been a committee chairman. And it's hard to see that the choice that Jonah just laid out. You could do stuff with Democrats, but there was a reason that past Republican speakers have insisted on what they called the majority of the majority, because meaning that I'm not going to pass anything unless I have a majority of my own conference. If you give that up, you're by definition a weak speaker, because you had a compromise with the Democrats. So I think that's going to be really, really hard. But in terms of the Senate, we found Nevada showed us that the Democrats, not the Republicans, were going to be in control of the Senate. Georgia will tell us whether the Democrats or Joe Manchin will be in control of the Senate. Because if it's 50-50, Joe Manchin's the center of the universe. If it's 51-49, he just becomes a regular old guy. Actually, he wants that. He's going to be up for re-election. He doesn't want to be, the guy who's deciding the fate of all this, because he has problems making up his mind, among other things. So I think based on what we know from the past, we'd have to say that Warnock is the favored. I think, because in the past in Georgia, which insists on 50% plus 1, that's a vestige of Jim Crow, because they didn't want Black voters, electing someone with less than 50 in a crowded field, electing someone with less than 50% of the vote. In the past, whoever was the leader going into the runoff has won. Also, just as a thought experiment, all those white rural voters who came out to vote for Kemp and against Stacey Abrams, are they going to come out just to vote for Herschel Walker when nobody else is on the ticket?
Right. Also, just so you know, procedurally, you cannot vote in the runoff unless you voted in the general. So they're only working with the universe of people who voted before. It just feels like Republicans
Who's going to switch from Warnock to Walker?
Right. So maybe it's the fight for that libertarian vote.
Yes, libertarian.
2 points.
What's really interesting about the libertarian, my first take was, that would go to Walker. Yeah. Libertarian, Republican. No, libertarian is like a catch-all for people who don't like either party. Right. It's not the libertarian ideology that Jonah could explain better than anybody, but it's not that. Yeah.
Right, no, libertarian, I mean, as a conservative from National Review, I've had my fights with libertarians for 25 years, but like the intellectual libertarians, that's not the Libertarian Party. The Libertarian Party is basically
None of the
a
above, right?
Star Trek convention on weed. And the thing that turned out libertarian voters in large numbers for the last 20 years has been pot legalization, which is not necessarily.
Sherman was for, yeah.
It's not really a result that automatically goes to Republicans,
Yeah.
right? So it's just a
Yeah.
complicated catch.
Yeah.
They just had a vote on that last night, didn't they? On cannabis and legalization,
Where?
For
the Congress.
research. Oh, I didn't know
I
that.
had no idea.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. Well, at an institution like this, that's been important.
Yeah.
because, we think cannabis has value medically.
Yeah.
Yet we can't do research on it
Yeah.
until the federal government says. you
Yeah.
will Be put in jail.
Right.
So it's interesting. So maybe at this point, I'll ask if there are questions from the audience. There's a mic there. Please go on up to the mic and ask a question.
You hear me now? Okay. Thanks for being here. This is great. I have a question sort of about the split House and Senate and funding and what that'll mean going forward. Particularly in the context of funding. I mean, we're up against the debt limit issue sooner rather than later. And importantly, for research funding. I mean, we've certainly learned over the last few years how important research funding is. I mean, it literally helped save the world in terms of COVID research.
Debt limit doesn't look like it's going to be raised in the lame duck.
Yeah.
That was something that Democrats had talked about. I mean, that's another question about Democrats. In the minority, it is easier to unify. Not, hopefully they won't form as many circular firing squads as they did when they were in the majority. But it sounds like the debt limit is going to be another one of these big
Games of chicken.
conflagration.
Yeah, I mean, on medical research generally, which is a question I've not put a lot of thought into, but I just gave a speech in Florida to the National Association of Electrical Distributors because I'm huge in that community. So I did some poking around about like what people think is going to come out of Congress generally, and the short answer is they're going to have to do the debt ceiling somehow, right? Because they have to. Defense reauthorization going to probably happen. Some screaming and yelling, but it's probably going to happen. The big ag bill going to happen because that's one of the few non-ideological things. I mean, again, screaming and yelling, but something happens, right? Because it's just there's too much log rolling for it. Just thinking about it through off the top of my head, I would not expect any new big funding for health kind of research because so many people in the Republican Party are so bought into the, Anthony Fauci works for Hydra kind of stuff, and like it's just too easy to demagogue from the sort of the fringy right now. That doesn't mean there'll be any cuts, right? But I think it would just be sort of glide path. Most of the lobbyist types I talk to think very little substantive gets done, good or bad, in the next 2 years. So for some people in the business community, that's actually great to know because certainty is better than, you can plan on certainty in ways that even if they'd like better news, but like knowing that it's not going to be bad news is actually pretty useful. So that's be my initial response.
Yeah, an institution like this depends on the federal government. We have a research budget pushing $700 million. A third or more of that is coming from the federal government, NIH in particular on this campus. And these are really important issues because you get held in limbo with funding or whatever. How does the university function? And we have to figure that out. Relative to COVID, it was a great example, I think, of Dr. Fauci is held in high esteem by some people here. I happen to be one of them. And the fact that he is a serious scientist in this and the way he got pulled down, I had a lot of trouble with that.
It'll be really interesting when the House Republicans start all their investigations. We're going to have a lot of investigations and very little legislation. They're going to go after Merrick Garland and Anthony Fauci and obviously Hunter Biden. But the question is, will that boomerang on them the way that some of the same things happened in this election? In other words, We don't know,
Yeah.
but it might.
I think you can make
Yeah.
a very strong case on a good government grounds that there are a bunch of investigations that should be done, but they should be done responsibly.
Yeah.
And so like,
I can imagine that.
I think a hearing on the origins of COVID stuff,
Yeah,
I think is perfectly valid. I think if the situation was reversed and you had someone like Hunter Biden in his relation and, you know, in a Republican administration, people would see that there's some sketchy stuff going on there. The chances that the Republicans do those kinds of delicate hearings correctly are very, very low.
And the Senate is not interested.
And the Senate's not interested, which is part of it. If you're ever trying to figure, I mean, Mara is much more expert on this stuff than I am, but if you're ever trying to figure out why the Senate seems sometimes not to touch crazy stuff the way the House does, it's because every senator has to get elected in a statewide race. And I mean, there are lots of reasons for it, but one of them is that. And the other one is they have longer terms, so they don't feel like they need to like tap into that stuff. But if you're in a statewide race, you need voters outside of your base in a way that you don't need if you're a House member in a gerrymandered district. And so it's always interesting to see which sort of hot button issues Democratic controlled Senate or Republican controlled Senate doesn't want to touch that are all the rage in the House.
How about other questions?
I'm gonna get some more water.
Hello, testing.
I have 100 questions, but I'm hoping to ask two. One of them you just touched upon briefly right there. Why do you feel that Kevin McCarthy's statement about fight against the other side or McConnell's one-term Obama presidency is good governing? I mean, they spend their time investigating and fighting and not doing the work of the people.
Well, that is what the Democrats are going to say. They're going to say, look, actually, when Joe Biden was asked about the investigations, he said something like, it's like a comedy. And then he said, you know, what, as my coach used to say, good luck in your senior year. And then he went on to say, I can't control what they do. I'm just going to keep my head down and work for the American people. That's what Bill Clinton did. That is a well-worn playbook for when you get a divided Congress, you automatically get a foil. And, you know, Joe Biden's going to have a foil for these Republicans that he's going to say all they want to do is, you know, do these investigations and not solve any of the problems the American people want solved.
But regardless of party, why is that you're not governing if you're?
The parties do that because they want to look up the incumbent for the next election. Just like Mitch McConnell is a very transparent, open guy. I mean, he will tell you what he wants to do, and he was very honest about that about Obama, and he failed.
Yeah, so I don't disagree with any of that. But sort of broader picture, sort of getting at, I think, at the heart of the question. We live in an era of what political scientists call negative polarization, right? And if you which means, so it's very interesting. The polling shows that most partisans really don't like their own party very much. They just hate the other party a lot more.
Yeah, they're going to vote against somebody, not for people.
So like my wife had my favorite New Yorker cartoon blown up and framed for me for my birthday a few years ago. And it has two dogs at a bar drinking like martinis in suits. And one dog says to the other, you know, it's not good enough that dogs succeed. Cats must also fail.
Yeah. That's what
politics is about. And like, it's very interesting. Like the way partisan identification, like I wrote about this in my last book, the political scientists and social scientists noticed in the last 10 years, like for the first time since they've been looking at any of these things, partisan identification is a better predictor of attitudes and behaviors than race, gender, ethnicity, any of that kind of stuff, which on one hand you think would be like good, because it means that people are discriminating against each other based upon their positions rather than some abstract, you know, arbitrary thing. But it turns out what it is no, it's that basically partisan affiliation is mapping in this country like religion. And it explains why so much of our politics, and social media makes this worse. There's lots of reasons for it. But so much of our politics is more about cats must fail than dogs must succeed.
Great story.
And my other quick question is, why doesn't the media stop reporting Latinx? I lived in South America for years. I know Latino and Latina, you can't ungender Spanish. Why can't?
But when you say the media, wait, the media,
Well,
you're saying that some media use Latinx as part of their terminology. Well, they shouldn't.
But they do. There are a lot of places that
Oh,
use it.
yeah, oh, okay.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I'd never either hear it on the radio or read about it in the paper.
I think it's a huge mistake. I mean, CPR doesn't do that, and believe me, we would be like the first culprit for that.
Yeah, but I think that this is part of this point I was making earlier about how the base of the Democratic Party isn't necessarily the sort of ideological shock troops of the Democratic Party. The people who are coming out of a lot of elite schools are taught this language, and they're taught it because they're taught that this is the inclusive way to talk. They're taught that this is good manners. So
Yeah.
I'm not saying that they're evil people or anything like that, but then they go from the real world, go to work in South LA and start calling everybody Latinx, and they're going to be like, "What are you doing? What are you saying?" And the poll reflects this. Only like 3% of Hispanics in America ever use the word Latinx. That means 97% either don't know it, don't like it, or take offense at it. And
It's a pronoun.
but the people who come into, I think, a lot of elite media, it's a transmission belt straight out of elite universities, and they bring that language with them.
This is really important. Why did the New York Times and all these other places send reporter after reporter to some working class bar in Ohio? Because those people are oddities to them.
Right.
Which is really upsets me, because that is one of the reasons why Democrats didn't get what was happening. Okay, of course, the flip side of that is Fox News going to send a lot of reporters to some upscale suburban women's book club to find out, what they're really thinking, or college campuses. But this is a problem. The donor class, the kind of elite, whatever we want to call it, meritocracy, conveyor belt, they become Hill staffers, they work as Democratic operatives. It's a problem. Tim Ryan was the model. He lost. It was a very red state in Ohio, but there were Democrats. John Fetterman is another one who kind of showed Democrats, yes, there is a different way to do this.
Right. We
can win white non-college rural voters, not win them, absolutely, but do less worse with them.
That's right.
Yeah.
We have time for one more question.
Think that ranked choice voting would by over 50% of the vote that get us consensus candidates who are more centrist rather than wingnuts who just have to get a plurality?
I'm a huge ranked choice voting fan. I mean, and top two primary. Yes, because when you have to get 50%, you have to appeal to the broadest swath of voters. So, yeah, and I do think that in California, where they have top two primaries, ranked choice voting is an instant runoff, basically. But in California, it's a very blue state. That hasn't changed. But I think that the Democrats that are sent to the state legislature there have become more moderate over time, because everybody participates in one primary, and then the top two vote getters go on to a runoff. And that's the same thing as ranked choice voting. The winner has to get over 50%.
Yeah, I'm increasingly in favor of it for primaries. I'm more in favor of getting rid of primaries. I think primaries have done terrible damage to this country. We are the only advanced industrialized democracy in the world where our parties don't get to pick their own candidates. And that's been a huge problem. Political scientists used to talk about this as democracy is the stuff that happens between parties, not within parties. And this gets to my point about weak parties. I want stronger parties. You wouldn't in a hospital put every surgical decision up for a vote, right? But for some reason, parties think every decision.
Zero.
Yeah. Anyway, so I want stronger parties. I understand there are problems with smoke-filled rooms. There are things you could do, but since that's not going to happen, ranked choice voting is better. For primaries. I'm not sure for general elections. I haven't thought it through enough. But like, if you look at Alaska, which I know a little bit about because my wife's from there, Sarah Palin was nobody's second choice.
Yep.
Right. And in full disclosure, my wife wrote Sarah Palin's second book. So like, I know Palin a little bit. She's gone off the rails, all that kind of stuff. But no, there's a reason why vanilla ice cream is the most popular ice cream in America. And it's not because it's everybody's favorite. Very few people's favorite. It's because it's the least objectionable flavor of ice cream. You can put a lot of stuff on it. If you're doing a wedding or whatever, you serve vanilla ice cream because you know it's not going to piss off anybody, right? And to have that kind of mitigating factor, since the leadership of parties are no longer going to screen out the crazies, let the voters do it through a mechanism like
The
that.
top two primary is getting rid of primaries. I mean, it's not really a primary if Democrats and Republicans are in it together. It's just a first round of a general election.
No, that's right. But my point is that it's not strengthening the parties.
Right, that's true.
And
But let's get rid of primaries.
I want parties to have
Yeah.
a vested
Yes.
interest in protecting their brand, and they don't have it now. They're, as Ross Douthat, friend of ours from the New York Times, put it, the parties are basically like fueled jets waiting on the tarmac, ready to be hijacked.
Yeah.
And Bernie Sanders almost took over the
Yes, and
Democratic Party,
Donald Trump did.
and Donald Trump did.
Yeah, yeah.
So maybe one parting question for you. We're a university. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. Alex?
All right, we do have one, I think you'll enjoy, anonymous question. You mentioned the fecal festival that we can expect in the House. When the dust settles, can you elaborate on the sorts of craziness you expect will happen? Hearings, subpoenas, impeachment?
So if the Republicans had a big night, like a shellacking night, 40, 50 seats, I think it would be more probable than not there'd be an impeachment. I mean, when you ask people, what are you going to impeach him for? They never really have a great answer. But there were some reports that Trump was actually calling around Republicans saying, not only are you going to impeach Biden, but how many times are you going to impeach him? Because he wanted to be like impeached fewer times than Joe Biden was. And that becomes very impeachment now. If it's only a handful of seats, it's almost impossible.
Like a censure. It's like,
Yeah, and I honestly don't think it's going to happen, right? I don't think you're going to get enough
Yeah.
votes. You're not going to get any Democratic votes, right? And but
not going anywhere in the Senate, obviously.
like McCarthy promised Marjorie Taylor Greene, at least according to Marjorie Taylor Greene, a bunch of plum committee assignments. So there could be all sorts of, let's get to the bottom of these Jewish space lasers kind of things that happen. And also just the performative nonsense that you'll get is going to be very, very high. And again, some of that just comes from the structure of how media works now, is that if you ever wonder, have you ever seen an important committee hearing and everybody basically says the same thing without asking any questions? It's because each one of them wants to be able to send a video clip of them saying that stuff to their constituents, because they know no one watched the whole hearing and it doesn't matter that everyone else said the exact same thing. And that's a structural problem with democracy right now that has less to do with ideological stuff. I don't know. I mean, for all we know, Trump's going to get back on Twitter and start tweeting like an escaped monkey from a cocaine study. I mean, everything is going to get weird.
Yeah, and Trumpism as a performative shtick is not gone, and it's only going to be more present in the House. And like Jonah said, the media, anything that's outrageous is going to get headlines. And the message of this election was boring wins. I don't know if that's the message that Republicans are going to internalize. Yeah.
But my point is, a strong party would internalize.
Strong party would,
Yeah.
but the Republican Party is, to me, the embrace of Trump or the capitulation to Trump in 2016 is just as cynical as the breakup with Trump now.
Mhm.
It's not that they said, oh, we disagree with him, he's bad for democracy. No, it's just, oops, he looks like a loser.
Right. He's hurting us now.
Yeah, he's hurting us now. Yeah.
So maybe a parting question. We're at a university. We've got 7,000 students here. How do we keep them civically engaged? Because these are important topics that we've been talking.
Yeah, Mara, how do you do that?
Well, I think okay. From the results of this election, they seem civically engaged. 18 to 29-year-olds still don't vote in numbers that they should. It's only 27% turnout, but it was pretty much the same as 2018, which was a very big year for participation of young people. I think that I don't know. I mean, I think if they can't understand how important it is to stay engaged, I don't know what else, climate change, Ukraine, American democracy, everything that they care about is in the balance. And I actually agree with Jonah. I used to tell groups in a normally high functioning democracy, the luxury and the privilege of living in one of those places is you get to tune politics out every 2 years. And then 2 years, you kind of read up on things and go vote. Nope, you can't do that now. Sorry. Everything is politicized. And yes, you have to vote for every election from dog catcher, every position from dog catcher to, president. That's just where we are right now.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that, look, I was at Fox for 11 years. I quit because I couldn't, the straw that broke the camel's back with some of the stuff that Tucker was doing. I'm now at CNN. It's part of my, it's what helps me pay my daughter's college tuition. But generally speaking, turn off cable news.
Oh my
Turn
God.
it all off.
Turn up. They have too much time to fill with not enough stuff to say to fill it. Just, yeah.
Just,
Don't watch cable news. Hey, I appear on Fox too.
Yeah,
And NPR,
but turn it off in prime
turn it off.
Yeah, I mean, like
Yeah.
like Brett shows special report, which Mara does, which I used to be on with them. That's fine. But like, no, I'm serious. I am serious about it. It's like a little island that pops, but like,
Yeah.
learning that any outlet where you can figure out that their business interest is in making you angry, just reject it, right? If so much of social media, so much of cable news, so much of the internet is about monetizing dopamine hits, about making people anxious, scared, angry. And if you see that, and that goes for MSNBC as much as it goes for Fox in a lot of ways, maybe not as much as it goes for Fox, but it's close. Rejecting all of that, get your news. I mean, I have my disagreements with NPR, but it's a good news outlet, and also just have a varied diet in your media consumption. Because so much of the problem with the media climate these days is that because politics is mapping like a religion and a lifestyle, it is in the business model of a lot of news outlets, including some really good ones, to tell their audiences what they want to hear rather than what they need to hear. And that kind of bubble think and group think stuff happens to almost every institution. It's not an ideological thing, it's a human thing. And so the one way around it is to vary your diet.
That kind of answers your previous question about young people being engaged. Look, the biggest conspiracy you can find online is the conspiracy to keep you online looking for a conspiracy.
That's right.
Because they can sell more ads. It's just a straightforward business model. Attention means you stay on longer, extreme content keeps you on longer, and they can sell more ads. It's as simple as that. Social media does this, the internet does this, cable news does this, super simple. So you want to stay informed, but you don't want to be mainlining social media all day. Those are actually two different things. And I also think that one thing we need to do in this country is revive K through 12 civics education, which would include media literacy and financial literacy, how to spot a conspiracy theory, how to understand what sourcing in a news story. I mean, people have no idea how to do that anymore. How to have a civil debate, where you start with a shared set of facts and work your way to opinions as opposed to the other way around. But these are big forces in American life. It's, the business model of social media is a very, very overwhelming thing. And Jonah just said this, but too many of us go read the media for affirmation, not information. It's really hard to get out of that bubble. There are news aggregators, that will give you a whole bunch of articles or websites you can click on one subject, so you can get the whole spectrum of views on immigration on that given day. But otherwise, you're going to have to do this yourself.
Yeah, I'm not doing this as a plug, but we launched the Dispatch, this media outlet that we do, to sort of model the behavior that we thought was missing in so much of the media. And one of the things we try to do, we have this, our main product is this thing, the Morning Dispatch. The whole idea of it is you read it in the morning and then you go on with your life. And it's not a, we take no advertising. So we're not incentivized to keep you refreshing the page all day long. It's purely a subscription newsletter business with, we have free stuff too, but because so much of the incentive structures of the internet, regardless of ideology, are, as Mara says, is to keep people like that monkey in the cocaine study,
Yeah.
clicking the thing for another pellet. And we kind of reject that. And I think people are getting wiser to it, but maybe not enough.
I wonder if the Elon Musk Twitter, however long it lasts, will break some of that, because advertisement is driving social media.
Yeah.
But I don't know.
Well, that's wisdom if I ever heard it. And I appreciate those comments. I think that was really useful. So wonderful time. I appreciate your frankness, which is good. And your insight into what's going on in our great country. So thank you for being here, and please, a round of applause.